Good afternoon. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you to the weekly BW Education Wednesday Wisdom. Over the last few weeks and over the last 16 months, we've been bringing you stalwarts from the business of education, from the education domain, from the education ecosystem, to talk to you about the future of education, the future of edutech, and the future of learning. Today, we have a leader, we have an individual who's set up companies, who's been in some way responsible for the IT manpower we have over the last 4 years in the country, who also set up a university in 2009, and who's really multifaceted. He understands education, he understands businesses, he understands skilling, and he understands technology. So clearly they couldn't have been a better person than Shri Rajinder Singh Pawar, who's the chairman of NIIT and also the founder of the NIIT University. He's a Padma awardee with us. Welcome, Mr. Pawar, for joining the BW Education Wednesday Wisdom. We spoke to you last year on education and the challenges in the business ecosystem. A lot has passed since then. What has changed in the last 16 months about education? And what is, and when I say education, I really mean higher education ecosystem. And what is the change that is for good and here to stay, and change which is not necessarily good and you would like to wish it away?
So first of all, thank you, Anurag. It's a pleasure to be back with you. You have very good questions always, so that's very exciting. So anyway, so first of all, I think the word unprecedented about COVID the passage of time, I get more and more sort of respect for the choice of that word, because everything has changed at least.
Yeah, you're very visible and audible.
You can hear me? Okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay. So, so a lot has changed. I think it's unprecedented is the right word that has been used. So everything that we do today is affected by COVID, right? So your question is, so far as education is concerned, what has changed and what has changed permanently? So first of all, let me just say that not more than a fourth has changed permanently. So 75% will be back to normal, because we are human beings, we are social beings, and we do things in a social setting. And the current setting is an artificial setting, a constrained setting. But let me also say this, that this situation has forced us into an unnatural state where we are forced to try new things to remain sane and to remain effective. And in a sense, we are all in a kind of a crucible of change. We are being forced to do certain things which we would have taken ages to do. And I think that the forcing has happened on a number of dimensions. So first and foremost, I think teachers have changed. And more than changed, I would say teachers have enlarged their range of capabilities. So if I have to say who's it most difficult for, this change is for teachers. I continue to hold that view. I held that view last year itself when they started. I wrote an article, I said, bored students and exhausted teachers. So the biggest stretch, I won't use in the word strain, is on teachers, because as against a class where they can see everybody, now they have a screen and they're trying to look at what's going on, and they cannot get a sense of what's happening. The students are in a new setting. Very often the parent peeps in at the back, and soon the teachers know the parent is sitting on the side and watching. So I think the repertoire of skills needed by teachers has changed. And a lot of it is a change for good, because they've learned how to adapt to this new situation. They've learned what is easy to do with technology and what is difficult. And I know that most teachers shunned technology in the past. They just thought it's impossible to deal with it. And then they had no option. And when you have no option, you do something. So was that early teaching good? I would say it was very, very poor. But it was infinitely better than zero. We also have to say that. The choice was do nothing. So one thing which has changed is that teachers have learned how to use technology far better. The second thing which has changed, and I hope a lot of it permanently, that parents have got involved in understanding what the students are learning and how they are learning. So the criticism we had that parents are not worrying about their children's education, I think this unprecedented situation forced parents to take a closer look at how education happens and what role should they play. I think this is a plus. It's been very stressful, but it's a very big plus. And then for students, I think for students, we'll probably see a relapse back to a lot of what was there in the past. Because for students, it's a socialization process. Parents send their children for studies, teachers come and teach, but students are living their life. So for them, it has been, as I said, I underline the word boring. It's been extremely boring to learn this way, right? And so when we talk of divides, and which I'll talk later, the difference between a highly self-motivated learner who could keep themselves involved and the fairly intelligent kids as well who got bored, that was a new kind of divide. But I think students also learned how to cope. They built resilience, they built discipline. But I think they were already reasonably comfortable with technology. They were playing games, they were doing stuff. So they have learned about technology. But I think they would perhaps be the one to revert the most into doing things like they did. If you ask any child, they're dying to get back to school and play with their friends or into
I agree with you.
And sit in the corridors. So that part of socialization would change very little.
You're absolutely right. And I want to tell our viewers that apart from being the founder of NIIT, the chairman of NIIT, is the founder of NIIT University. He's also been on the board of the Indian School of Business, and he's also been a member of the governing board of his alma mater, the Scindia School. So clearly he understands education from multiple perspectives. And just to buttress Mr. Pawar's point further, I am on the board of my alma mater, MDI, and I'm also the chairman of the alumni. And last week, one of the student representatives of the current batch called me and said, "So we are missing the on-campus thing. Could you let us know when will it open?" So they are pushing for it to open. They want it to open. In fact, he wrote me a long mail about what is the difference between being on campus and not being on campus. He talked about the access to the library in a physical way. While these are millennials and very technology savvy, as Mr. Pawar said, they are seeking a social experience through education, which is also an interesting part of education.
You just try and remember, Anurag, yourself. If I ask you, what do you remember about your school days and college days? I bet you won't remember anything of what happened in the classroom.
I do remember some.
Well, you will some sessions, some lectures we remember, but bulk of what we remember is the social processes around the classroom, in the corridors, under the tree, talking to a teacher who come across socially. So that socialization process, the collaborative learning process, the throwing ideas at each other process, those have been missing to a large extent. And I think that really is what helps us become what we become. And what we did in the online learning was to get a lot of content. We, of course, simulated the immersion and so on and so forth. But the human development process was what was missing. And I think that's what everybody's waiting for. And therefore, that will not change. And perhaps a good bit of that should not change.
Absolutely. So clearly, Mr. Pawar is making a case for at least a hybrid education, that the physical campus will be there and there will be technology through which some teachers would be imparting learning and education. And in a recent BW Education Wednesday Wisdom, somebody said the future of education is about not about replacing teachers, it's about replacing teachers who don't use technology. The future of education is about having teachers who use technology in a much bigger way. Okay, so clearly Mr. Pawar is making the same point here. Mr. Pawar, let me ask you again. You spotted more than 4 decades back the need for the kind of skills India needs, and that's how NIIT was set up. You also, you did skilling ahead of everyone, really, whether it was NIS Sparta, or whether it was Net University, or it was NIT in terms of training IT professionals. You saw that 4 decades back and clearly prepared the country for such a revolution. Now, today we are in 2021. In your view, what are the skills of the future? Which are the skills of the future? And are educational institutes geared up to providing the skills of future?
So first of all, let's now realize one thing, that when we started our careers way back, you started a bit later than me, we visualized what we wanted to be. And that kind of definition was somewhat clear. You want to be an engineer, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be a doctor. And we also planned for a span where we would retire at 58 or 60. So let's say about 35, 37, 38 years of work. Today's people who are coming into higher ed will plan for roughly double that span. Will plan for about 70 years of work, at least 60. People will be fit and healthy to work till 80s, mid 80s or 90 by the time they reach that time. Some, of course, say you'll be working at 100 as well. Also, the amount of change which has happened in the last 30 years, we will see that happening every 5 years. So to predict the future is a futile exercise. And therefore, to plan to educate people for their future is a futile exercise. So therefore, what do you plan? What do you prepare them for? So therefore, I think the sentence which has been running around for a long time is learning to learn. Learning to learn. Okay, that is one big sentence, that it's not the subject that you learn, because we have learned in this time also, we've learned that we can learn anything. Just see how many first-class chefs we have created in this country, in your family. Look around. Okay. So people who are curious to learn will learn a lot. That opportunity is becoming real. So a very curious learner will learn a lot on their own, but that's a small percentage of people. For the bulk of the people, we have the education system. So therefore, preparing for the future is about preparing to learn. And this is again not new, it's been talked of before. But I guess what's happening is the pace at which things are changing. We can already see the youngsters in the last 20 years, if you can see how often they have changed their jobs, how freely they are moving from one company to the other, one profession to the other. So even if you look back and say, okay, ask your friends and children and nephews and nieces who started work 10, 15, 20 years ago, they've already made their first 1 or 2 changes, to go back and say, were they imagining what they're doing now? And second question is, what of what you learned is coming in handy, right? So 2 set of things will emerge. One is that you have to have these basic, you have to have curiosity, you have to revive your curiosity. Then you have to build skills to analyze things. You have to learn how to absorb information and make sense of information. And of course, the basic thing about reading, writing, maths, all of that is important. But you have to start becoming more analytical. You have to start becoming more questioning. You have to force yourself to go back to the level of curiosity you had when we were 2-year-old. Okay, curiosity just drops with school education. If you have curiosity, today you have the opportunity to learn. And since you don't know what you'll be doing 20, 30, 40 years in the future, don't invest too much into learning wet technology of cement manufacturing or dry technology of cement manufacturing. Do that, because there will be degrees you have to do. But on the fringes of it is what you have to learn. And that's what we find youngsters. In fact, in this period, the number of students at our own university I've seen who've done additional courses which may or may not be linked to what they're doing, or they may be adjacent. It's quite amazing. And we see that happening. So this has changed. So therefore, we shouldn't really make a list of careers of the future. And I would say, it's a good thing for a student to imagine that I don't know what I'm going to do in the future. But the first step, I think I know. Let me prepare for the first step. And the first step could be anything. And there perhaps just doing what you love to do is a safe bet, because we do know that you do well only in things you love to do. So if you want to keep navigating many careers, don't get into a boring job because someone says it's good, because you won't be able to get out of it. but something you love and enjoy, you'll be able to navigate from there. So I want to make this very emphatic statement that chasing career visions is a futile pursuit for the youngsters of today. They should see what they like in the beginning. They should look for institutions which are open, which are giving freedom, which have a good environment, which have good faculty, of course, who will challenge them, and which have very good peer groups. So to me, that is more important than where I want to end up.
Absolutely. Mr. Pawar, you're articulating what I believe in. Confucius said, make your hobby your profession, you don't have to work. So clearly, if you choose a profession that is in some way in sync with what you like doing, clearly you're likely to excel at it and become someone. You're absolutely right about that, but finding your own ikigai is not that easy. Let me ask you my third question. Last few weeks saw the CBSE exams being done away with, being postponed, being done away with. Now we've had a traditional system of evaluation for such a long period. From your time, from my time, from Vasudha's time. Now, do you think this opportunity to reset the process of evaluation is a real opportunity? Do you think we'll be able to reset our education system? Do you think we need to reset our education system? And if at all, what should this new reset be?
So first of all, on the cancellation of exam, I want to make one point, which is that I think it's very good that it happened. Not just because there was a health issue; those are important. But I think if children had given their exams under the mental stress they have now, their performance wouldn't have been a good indicator of the caliber. As it is, we have a question on whether we really measure the right things. It would have been patently unfair because a child who has a situation in their family which is troublesome, versus a child who at that time didn't have a situation, they would have performed differently. So for that reason alone, I think it was absolutely necessary to cancel. But you come to two basic points. Does it need to change? I think a lot need to change in education. And let me say this, having done operations in 40 countries, not only in India, we are very critical of our education system, but every country has its education system a couple of centuries behind. And I have found that we reform many things in life. Governments reform many things in life. But the last bastion of reform in policy is education in every country. So why it is, we'll not get into it, but there is a need to change. Now, this unprecedented window comes up. And I think it's great that the national new education policy got announced just before that, around that time. Okay, it was talked of in 19, came in 20. It's interesting to see how much of what we want to have in new education is captured in that. Now, you can go back even 20 years back and see the new education policy of that. That also talked of a lot of change, but nothing changed. But this policy actually went much deeper, right from childhood learning all the way to higher ed. And in higher ed, it talked of a number of things. So I want to tell you, having been involved in education for more than 4 decades, and having been involved in technology for learning for that period, we introduced multimedia in 1981. We have found that the assessment process remains elusive, remains highly defective. Defective is wrong, highly
inaccurate.
Complete. More than it's like the old story you heard about someone looking under a lamp for something which is lost on the ground in a dark place, and people come to help him and they keep looking and he says, well, it's not here. Where did it fall? The person says, fell in the dark, but there's no light there. So I'm looking where I can see. So exams look for very little of a child's potential. So this situation has actually forced us to open our mind on how to see assessment. And if you see how we did last boards, 10th class, I think the schools were told, CBSE told the board that look at how the child was performing, let the school make a judgment, let them give you some data. Same thing we'll do for class 12 now. So another thing which is changing is the ability of the education system to judge the child with a little more data than this one exam. That is happening. But even that is not enough. So my view is in going from school to college, and to some extent from college to a job, these are two hops for a child. The college to job, to me, I think is still a bit of a connection, but school to college is an absolute disconnect. The school child has no clue where they will reach. The school has no clue what the college does. The college has no clue who's coming. At least at the NIT University, for the last 10 years, we've been doing an interaction between the student and faculty. And last few years, with online becoming prevalent, we were doing it online from the beginning, but much more completely online last 6 years. Have an interaction, an admission interaction where you try and judge those things you cannot judge in a board exam or in a written test. So how would you judge a child's social sensitivity, something becoming so important? How will you judge their creativity? How will you judge their innovation? How will you judge their curiosity? The thing that matters the most, and we talk about it all the time, cannot easily be judged by a written exam. So therefore, the suggestion which I'm putting is that every university and college should change how they assess students who are coming in. So give weightage to the marks. I'm not saying you don't disregard. Give 2/3 of the weightage because children have done their work in school. But keep reducing that with time and keep increasing your investment as a higher education institution to judge the individual and see their aspiration and see their interests. So I think this is happening at the same time. The NEP talks about that extensively. It talks about the bridging. It talks about attributes. It talks about holistic learning. So we have to judge and evaluate from that point of view. And this is the time. And I would say that, I also feel that this century, we are seeing a large number of new universities in India, which will become our Ivy Leagues. They're actually experimenting a lot. And to government's credit, I think UGC and so on have opened up their minds quite a lot in this period. In a sense, we're forced to, all of us are forced to, and they're letting institutions experiment. So I think it'll be very valuable to see what we learn out of this experience. And we've been at it for 10 years. And for us, the NEP is like a document we were trying to live and work on. And we've got evidence that many of those things work very well.
Okay, clearly, I hope policymakers take note of what you say and implement. At this point, I'd like to bring in my editorial colleague, Vasudha Mukherjee, to ask the next set of questions. Vasudha, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Batra. Mr. Pawar, you've already started talking about the new education policy. So I'd actually like to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit. And you're talking about changing, talking about opening up and trying to really assess a student. But what are the parts of the new education policy that are absolutely critical that we get right or that we execute in a manner that can enable this movement that you're talking about?
So I think there's also a lot of discussion last few decades, but crystallizing now on what are we trying to do in education, that fundamental question. And recently we had at the NIT University, we had a very good lecture on working for a living and working to build a better life. So making a life and making a living, right? So quite clearly at the various levels in the income hierarchy, at the lower levels, it's about making a living. I think that's the important thing. But now that we have millions of people in the middle class and upper middle class, they're also worried about making a life. And so how to be successful in life, and for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, you have to work and you have to be happy. You have to make a good life. So the new education policy captures the essence of this extremely well. So it captures the purpose, it captures the meaning, it captures about holistic learning, it captures about interest of the learner, it captures about giving freedom to the student to learn, to navigate the path. It talks about, for example, the academic bank of credits. It talks about that idea. It says a student should go around collecting credits from wherever they can get. Institutions should be flexible to let students come in and out. But the student-centered learning where I like this, I want to learn this, I accumulate the credits as I go. So this kind of flexibility is, I think, what is being talked of, first of all. And this type of flexibility is key. So So institutions have to be flexible. They have to give options. They have to let students navigate. They have to let them change their path. They have to let them become holistic. They have to look at the word extracurricular has to be thrown out because everything is curricular. So at NIT University, once we were watching a play by a group of students, and I asked the Vice Chancellor, I said, this is outstanding. How many hours have they put in? And the in charge of drama, she said they put in maybe 100 hours this semester. And I said, how many hours do they put in for the math class? They said about 40. So I said, how many credits do they get for doing what they're doing in drama? Because they're learning one hell of a lot. They said nothing. And we started changing that. So we said the word extracurricular has to be thrown out. Everything is curricular. You're making a life. So you get credits. If you work, students who work on organizing events and so on and so forth, the building management capability. So even that hobby has to get credits. So the policy talks of that as well, that everything is curricular. So it talks about freedom to students to move, freedoms to institutions. So institutions, in my view, need freedom at 3 levels. And the NEP is supporting that somewhat. It has to become more explicit. One is, I would say, curricular freedom. Earlier, we used to say, let the universities decide what they want to teach. Now, in the best institution, the faculty decides. And in today's institution, we are saying, let the faculty and students work together to decide what is to be taught. So curricular freedom should be given to institutions. Then there's administrative freedom. What to start, which course to start, which course to stop. So in higher education, I can say one thing, and I can say for engineering education for sure, we have more supply than demand. We have more seats. So what is that doing? That is getting the survival of the best. And the students are smart enough in today's world to figure out. Okay. So they're choosing, right? And they're choosing. So when you have that situation, that forces organizations to change. So I think opening up the institution, letting them do administrative reforms is the second one. And third is the financial reform. Let students figure out ways of earning while they learn. Let institutions formulate methods. Let there be very creative methods of scholarship, and let government actually fund scholarships so it reaches the student, rather than just giving it to institutions who have no accountability to anybody. So I think these 3 types of reforms are what should be pushed, and the NEP in principle talks of many of these and many more. So I think flexibility, student-centeredness, future orientation, permitting people to go in and out, making it more open. I think that's the spirit. And as I said, the unprecedented COVID has created a space for people to try. And I do see the regulators recognizing this and giving more freedom. So I hope that that's one of the things which doesn't change. We talked about what changes, what is changing. I hope this freedom in the regulator's mind opens up even more to let there be a natural flow.
Absolutely. And, it's like in one of other forums, someone said that, the policy is a policy, but we still have to create the pathway. And it sounds like you are taking so much out of the policy and what it could mean and what the potential is. And it's quite interesting to hear all of that. So thank you for sharing that. And I want to just go back a little bit. This talked about, the difference between school education and higher education and how it's a leap for a lot of students, and how it can be very difficult for students to come from school and then enter higher education and they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what they want. What are you doing in your university or your education institute to kind of help students deal with this and kind of figure out what they want to do and embracing this whole NEP policy changes that they want to bring holistic learning in?
So I think I'll generalize this, and I would really want, I know more and more institutions are trying to do this, but everybody should do it. So first of all, I think universities should recognize that the students are coming to them from school, then they need to build a bridge. They need to build a bridge to schools, right? And the bridge should reach out, in my view, to class 7, maybe 8 or 9, right? And students in school should get a view into what happens in universities, and faculty in universities should know what students are doing there. So I'd like to call it the admissions bridge. So in our university, we're trying to identify about 250 odd schools from where we have been getting students, where we get students and say, let's invest in building this bridge to give those students a visibility of what happens in higher education. and give this university student faculty a visibility of what's coming. And so in our admission interaction process, we do early admissions as well. We start before board exams. We actually make offers to students before they give the board exams so that they can get a conditional offer, which they can exercise. But if we have given the offer based on class 10 and the interview, we see them fit. But they go to the board exam without having to worry about, where will I go in education? But surely they change their mind, they make their options as they go. So it's free for students to make their choices. So I would like more and more universities to reach the students and educate them about possibilities. So they also get a little more equipped to see where they want to go.
Yeah, definitely. Programs where students can come to university for a day, maybe sit in classes. See
more
what is
than a day,
available.
more than a day. And now I think we've learned. We've learned in COVID that our faculty could be teaching them every weekend.
Yeah.
This has happened. So these bridges are now virtual, and we've all practiced that. Teachers have used it, students have used it. So our vision and dream of converting our physical bridges into virtual bridges is happening, and I think every institution should be doing that.
Yes, absolutely. Because also, like we said, the knowledge is available. What you're teaching is the experience, the skills, and that's what's unique to an higher education institute, not necessarily the content of the education, because that's available everywhere these days. And to come in, actually see the difference between seeing all the stuff online and actually experiencing learning is a very big difference. We do have a question from the audience. I was wondering if we could bring it up. Ani, I'm sorry, I'm not going to try pronouncing your last name, but is asking, Mr. Pawar, cost of education is increasing for an average student and family. What are your thoughts to curtail this, especially keeping in mind tier 2, tier 3 cities and towns?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I was trying to look for I couldn't find it. Repeat
Yeah, he's typed it in the Q&A session. His name is Ani Agnihotri. Mr. Pawar, the cost of education is increasing for an average student and for the family. What are your thoughts to curtail this, especially keeping in mind the tier 2, tier 3 cities and towns? So Ani, I don't know, a gentleman or a lady is concerned about the rising cost of education.
No, so I think this is a very big question. This is truly a big question. So we actually have to ask that should it not be government's responsibility to pay for all of education? All of us would love it. But then when you put yourself in the role of saying how much money does the government earn and how does it spend? And what are the contentions? Now we know that health doesn't get enough. Health has to get it as well. So there's a contention. So the reality is that unfortunately we don't have enough money to make education in the reach of everybody. So therefore, what should be done? My view is that, first of all, that a very highly motivated, curious student in today's time will be able to pick up a lot on their own because of this unprecedented situation. That's one reality, right? And they can then participate in, today more and more institutions are finding many ways to search bright students. A good institution's primary job is to get bright students. Its future depends on that. And more are actually putting together scholarship programs. So we have, I think 2/3 of our students get some kind of scholarships. And that's purely determined by merit. So I'll first stay with the issue that bright students have in history of education been able to get education with scholarships. I think today it's becoming more possible. And when I talked about the fact that now supply exceeds demand, we can see how institutions are trying to get good students by getting the brighter ones. And my only point is bright only shouldn't be equal to class board exam results. It should be a weightage between marks and capability. So first thing is, I think bright students who are curious and very keen to learn, I would urge and say that they should be searching around for opportunities to see where they can get a better option and where they can get a scholarship. Second is, as I said, I think in this century, we are finding more and more people coming in and setting up newer institutions. So there will be a dispersal. There'll be those who can afford to charge very little and keep it sustainable. And there'll be those who want to make it sustainable and will charge what is a market fee. And if they charge too much, I think they'll find it difficult. So because there's a supply-demand equation, it'll settle somewhat. In engineering, it is settling now. We have choices. In management education, it's settling. We have choices. So I think there's no easy answer to this, but I would say that for bright students with a lot of motivation, they should search much more to find options where they can get good education at a sensible fee. And of course, we are urging people all the time, people who've done well in life, to set up institutions, more and more institutions, and more institutions are being set up. The government on its part is setting up a large number of institutions as well. So I think there is the capacity is building up in many sectors, and many it isn't. In medical, it isn't, for example. They should be opening up that a little more so that more and more people come in. And my view is that students, people keep saying the gullible student. I mean, there's no such thing as a gullible student. In today's time, they are so savvy that sitting anywhere, they can make choices. They have likes, they have followers, they have so many methods to discern. So there's demand, supply being in excess of demand is a very good thing that is happening. And it will perhaps moderate the costs to some extent. On top of which, bright students should search and look for where they can get an institution which values more than just their marks. Their marks are important, I would say, and more, other attributes as well. They're willing to listen. Most universities are not opening to listening. To me, that's the first example that students should look at. And if they listen, they're likely to look for bright students. And we would love to get bright students, I can tell you, on behalf of many good institutions, and award them scholarships to have the bright talent on the universities.
Fantastic. I think you answered Ani's question well. Let me ask you the next set of questions. Mr. Pawar, clearly today, one of the paradoxes is that when we talk of the well-being, we always say that as individuals, we should spend less screen time, because screen time, it is science has proved that screen time has its own negatives. They say before you sleep, you should not be on white light. You shouldn't be surfing digital devices. I sleep with my mobile phone in a room very far away from my bedroom, so that I have to make an effort to go to the phone if in the night I need it, and I shut off because that's the only way to. But students are 24/7 glued to their digital devices. Digital devices seem to be part of their body. And with this virtual education and the social on-campus experience missing, what is happening to the mental health of students? Give us a sense of what do you think is happening, and what can be done in cases where the mental health may not be in the best space?
So there are two factors here which I want to segregate, because I think you want me to comment on both. One is just using the devices. And the second is this period which forced students to force them to use devices more than they should have for learning. So are you concerned about both, or just any one of them? Because I can answer.
Yeah, they're interrelated, Mr. Pawar.
Yeah.
One is access to devices,
let me say the following.
Okay.
COVID or no COVID, if you give children a chance, they'll be on the device all the time and they have no problem. Okay, we have a problem, right? But COVID being on the screen was a pain. There's a difference. So now let me first talk about this COVID time, because this has been a traumatic time for education. I have to say that. It's a traumatic time. Does it mean we've lost everything? No, we've learned a lot as well. But it has been a traumatic time for teachers, particularly. And it's been a very difficult time for children. And it's been an equally different time for parents living in small homes where the mother works, the father works, and they have 2 bedrooms or 1 bedroom, and then how you're coping with those kind of occupational challenges over and above that. But I would say that the cumulative stress of this during COVID times has been astronomical. And unfortunately not fully recognized. Because mental health doesn't show up as easily as a COVID infection.
Right.
We all know, when you look at the work that psychoanalysts do, they're trying to dig something. You go at the age of 50 to them and trying to dig what happened to you at age 2 or age 3 and shaped your life. Right?
Absolutely.
Right? Or counselors who will see what's happening in your life and try and help you with that problem. Easier issue, but you have layers and layers. So when you talk about the human mind and don't use the screen at night, I have to say we don't know much about how the mind works. With today's science, that's another lecture. I think this is the century of the mind, and we have to go back to the knowledge that we as a civilization hold enormous amount of knowledge of how the mind works. But we are saying that you sleep for 7 hours and children for 8 hours, because the amount of stuff the brain does when you're asleep is quite phenomenal. It has to organize itself. It has to clean up the muck of the day, which may show up as dreams, or if it's a peaceful day, show up as deep sleep, or last images come to your mind. So we know very little. But we do know that stresses show up over a period of time. And I think this is where the parents' role comes in. The parents are closest to the stresses of the child. And I can say for a school like my school, Scindia School, where we have 65 teachers and only 500 students, they're like parents because they stay on the campus. And even when the children were at home, they were in touch with them every day. And they were talking to their parents about the difficulty the children were feeling. So I have very good views on those challenges they have faced. At school level, parents and students talk to each other. College, they don't talk that much, as you know, right? So we get that break. But the psychological stress on students, particularly school students, therefore I'll say first year as well, is quite devastating, and parents should recognize it. And if we are short of medical staff, as we call it, we are very much shorter of mental health staff. Very much, right? So I would say, therefore, where there are joint families, we had the granny as a psychologist, and the granddad as a psychologist or a philosopher, and an aunt who's very sensitive. Now in the nuclear family, that is not so. So how do we cope with this? And I would even urge and say that every parent should find that uncle or aunt who can talk to their child, because the kids will not talk to their children, right? And create those conversations. Because this is an unsolved problem. And I think it's going to play out, and we better recognize it. We don't have a solution yet. But I think parents should recognize this challenge, because good schools can. I think boarding schools have a very big ratio and they have 24 hours the child with them. But day schools who have 3,000 kids, I mean, the burden on the teachers and the principal is unbelievable. They just don't get that extra time with children. So I think getting that time with children, whether school does it or the parent has to do it, is an absolute necessity. We should find the time. I think we have to find the time and recognize and use our common sense. We don't have to be psychoanalysts. I think we have to have common sense to recognize.
Thank you so much. Now, let me ask you, there's another question from Ratul Rudra. Ratul Rudra asks you, as we see that education has gone online, which it has, and I think this COVID situation is going to stay here for at least some time more, what do you think that the education system can do in rural parts of India, especially without the availability of technology? And if I may add, Ratul, some in cases, even the availability of electricity, you know. So the question Ratul is asking is EduTech creating, because of the COVID situation, while it's been a bridger and bridging the digital divide in some cases, in rural India, the access to education has gone away. How do we solve that problem?
So first of all, I do want to say, Anurag, it hasn't only gone in rural India. Even in urban India, the divide is quite acute. It's quite acute. So people who work in my home, we are busy trying to give them some device. And I hear about the government schools, children are using a little smartphone to study. How much more difficult that is compared to a large screen, first of all, just let's recognize. But I'm also amazed to see the innovation of many of the teachers. So another divide which has happened is between how teachers are coping with this. I've been amazed to see such innovative work by some government school teachers when I talk to my driver and talk about how the son learns, of how they're working this stuff. So there are many, many divides happening. So the difficulty is also in the urban settings, but at least in the urban, there may be a Wi-Fi, there may be a 4G, there may be a method to get it cheap. Now, this is where I think we have been collectively as industry, as education, as IT sector working, pushing the government to realize the dream of fiber optic to the last village. The national plan to put fiber optic to the last mile. I think that recognition has become so much more acute. And therefore, our expectation, because a lot of the fiber is already laid, a lot of it is laid. Now it has to be finished and brought up. And we have to pass light through it and bring it alive. So I think this period has also brought home this point that if every village had been connected and if every panchayat room had a device which was connected, how much more we could have done and how much more evidence exists right now. So I think that is something. And again, look at the NEP, the policy talks about the centrality of technology, talks about the centrality. So to me, I think this is work in progress, should get a huge priority, because I think, you also, Vasudha said that content is there. Enough content is there enough for everyone, anywhere in the world. So we first need to connect and give a device. And as I said, if you make a normal distribution of some very bright and curious kids, they will need nothing. They will need just a connected device which takes them into the world. And that's maybe 5, 10, 15, 20% of the really bright students who will rise on their own and come into life. For the rest, we'll have to have classroom, we'll have to have a structure, we'll have to have attendance, we'll have to do all the socialization things which we need to do, because kids want to run out of the classroom to go anywhere in the world. Okay, so how do we get them to have fun inside? How do we make it more fun? How do we make them connected? How do we have, so many things can be done. And the good news is in this period, which is the unprecedented period, a lot of very innovative teachers, hardcore villages are trying new things. And there are some initiatives, people like Nandan are doing some initiatives to bring technology in the hand of school teachers in all settings and getting them to start collaborating. There's some very good evidence coming out of that. So now I think we need that connectivity, and we need the panchayats to have devices, which is easy to do because panchayats are coming alive more and more. So I think we can see now what can happen. We have seen the possibility. And question really remains that if the NEP 6% demand of the budget can go, I was hoping when the NEP wrote an article, I had only one message. Just put that 6%, everything will happen. But I now recognize that health is perhaps a more burning issue. And it may get preference, at least in the near term. But to me, these two are the most important things in society where money has to go. So at least put the networks in place and then let those who want to get started on them.
Mr. Pawar, clearly with virtual online education and the fact that both professionals and students are looking to add multiple skills. Also, rather than getting skilled once in 5 years, once in 10 years, or doing a linear degree, possibly adding skills and courses, and that has given to the rise of edutech, right? And clearly, what edutech companies are doing is pioneering, and it's a start of an era. So clearly, they're very valuable. The future, they may have even a larger impact. But what do you have to say about the valuations of edutech companies? And what's your view? Because you're also an entrepreneur, you listed your company, you're also an angel investor, and you have a perspective on these things. We'd love to get your perspective on the edutech players and the valuation of edutech companies.
Well, first of all, let's recognize this huge anomaly that while the world is in trouble, the share markets are somewhere else, right? We can see that. And that's driven by many, many factors. But, and so for example, more and more people sitting at home at all levels are saving more money. And the financial markets have found the idea of the systematic investment plan. You can put 100 rupees a month. This phenomena all over the world has got a lot more money, the middle class going into the market, in addition to the big players. Okay, lot more money. So there's lot more money chasing good ideas than we ever had before. So while we have this huge problem of the COVID, we also have this interesting phenomena happening, right? So therefore, a lot more money is coming and chasing new ideas, chasing the needs of today. And the needs of today are health and education. So it's only natural that you're finding that, and of course, technology, because the technology is becoming the basis for digital transformation. And digital transformation is about everything. Everything is transforming. How we do everything is transforming, right? How we buy vegetables is transforming. How we cook, how we learn about food, how we get a cab, everything is changing. So digital transformation of everything, that sector, the IT sector, that is benefiting. The health sector, more and more money is coming, but we need very much more than what we have. That is benefiting. And the education sector, which is a need of the hour, not only for more education, but different kind of education, that is also drawing money. So therefore, each of these sectors is drawing a lot of money, and again, demand supply comes to work. So I'm told today is an unusual day. Some 4 IPOs are happening today, or 3 or 4 IPOs are happening, never happened. So entrepreneurs recognize that when money is flowing in, you should stand on the door side and wait for the money to come, because entrepreneurs need money and want to take risks. So it is good that more money is available. But at moments like this, I think we also have to recognize that if you're an investor, you have money, but you have to be more careful, right? So there's a demand supply imbalance which will even out. So you have to be careful. So I would say that it's good that EdTech is getting money, and the education is getting money, because it'll create ideas, okay? And the money, it's risk, so some will work, some will not work, right? So you're taking a bet on that. But it is good that more and more money is being fueled into the education sector, into the EdTech sector. But it's happening in very uncertain times when risk takers are coming forward, and the person putting the money in is also a risk taker. And the person who's thinking of an idea is also a risk taker. So India, as you know, is the 3rd largest startup country, and it's not too long before we become the biggest or the 2nd biggest. Because a large number of young people, Anurag, are not looking at a career. They want to do a startup. They don't know what it means, but that's the fashion. And it means doing something I love to do, and some money is available, so what can I do? And there'll be failures. We talk of fail fast in startups, right? Fail fast and learn fresh. So startup valuations are high because there's more money. So more money is coming is a good news, but then we'll have to see how they put that money to use. Like it's happened in every such wave that came, that a few survived, and they have to have better ideas. They have to be flexible. They have to merge and modify, and the investors will put the money in, and hopefully more and more good will come out of it.
Okay. My last question, and then I was to ask the absolutely last question. Now, last time also we were talking, and because of COVID, we said while the charm of the Ivy League is the charm of the Ivy League, because it's about socialization, it's about, those universities are good, let's be very clear. But will the last 16 months of COVID ensure that more and more Indian students look for Indian universities that are preeminent to study? Is that a trend you see holding for a long time, or you will see it as a transient trend and then people will start going back to Ivy League colleges?
So again, I have this is a very personal question, I have to say.
Of course.
Me and my co-founders had a choice after IIT to do what many people were doing and go out, but we chose not to be here. So I have a bias, okay? And my bias is that you're born in this country. You have to do stuff for this country by what you can do. But does it mean I'm against students going abroad to study? No, I wouldn't say that, because that's a personal choice. Okay. Number one. Number two is a lot is changing. I mean, to me, the hottest place on this planet, not hottest in terms of climate, that's separate.
Yeah, we understand in terms of
the
where
hottest
the action
place
is opportunity.
is India. It's the biggest democracy. It's going to be the largest country in the world. It is where the maximum opportunity exists. And it's a free market democracy. So we have all the glitches, we have all the difficulties, but it's inevitable. And we have the youngest population. So India, like many other countries, have been through the population bulge and benefited historically. This is India's time now. Other countries, the populations are falling and aging. Our population is young and huge. And these youngsters have to do something. So we have to equip them to do it in this country. And therefore, the notion of the great universities of the world is changing. To me, the new universities being created in this country in the last 20 years and I don't want to use the word Ivy League because it has a foreign connotation, are the Nalandas of the future. Okay, and I don't want to be kind of prudish and say, we were flying rockets and all that in the past. It's about brains to solve today's problems today. And of course, even students who go outside, I feel happy when they come back. And I know that my generation of people who went didn't come back. But those who went in the last 10, 15 years, they're flying around between the two countries, doing a startup here, doing it here, listing it in the US, coming back. So there's much more mobility. So that's a reality. But I tend to feel that we have to provide more and more opportunities in India because intelligence is not distributed along the lines of wealth. We know that. Enough evidence in the world. So how do we get the brightest in our country to get an opportunity? You can't take a child who studied in a government school in the village and quite easily send them to a completely different social setting. In fact, we did work in a small community when we had an NIT center, and we equipped them to go and work in Bangalore, and they all ran back. They said, this is just uncomfortable. I want to be in my small little town and live my life. That phenomena holds for many, many bright young Indians who want to be in the social setting. So what are we doing for that is my bigger concern. And therefore, when I said, if there's a network connection in the village school and I can go and search and figure out what is available in this country, I would say that's what we should pitch for. Now, I do know that international universities want to come here, and they are doing it because they need students. They're aging population, they don't have students. Let's be very candid about that. And they want bright students. So they will come here. And that's
fantastic.
That's the
you and Vasudha are biased because you both studied abroad and have come to India. I've never studied abroad. I stayed in India. But I understand
studied in India always. Yeah. All my life.
Yes. But
I traveled everywhere.
Yeah, travel everywhere. That's what I meant. But in Vasudha's case, she studied abroad and she's chosen to come back to India. That's for sure. Vasudha, your last question.
Yes, I know we've talked a lot about changes and a lot about what we want to see happen. And I would actually like to ask you a slightly personal question because you shared so much of your viewpoints with us and been so open with us about your what you think should happen in the education system. What is your definition of success?
Of
success?
Okay, that's a very good question. So one is I'll tell you to attend a lecture which our Chief Scientist and Professor Emeritus Sugata Mitra, and also a lecture by a person who's very close to us. I think we haven't done. We have to do something with Arun Kapoor, Anurag. I don't know if you've done something. Who set up?
No, I've not done mine. I'd love to because my kids.
So we'll do a three-way thing. He's set up the Royal Academy for the King of Bhutan last 10 years. And both these gentlemen are talking about the purpose of education in very interesting ways. And so Gurcharan Das, when he talked about, making a living and making a life, he alluded to this question about, what do we live for? And so it's different at different levels in the income hierarchy. But eventually, I think we all want to live a full life. And we want to be able to do what we want to do. We want to be happy with it. We want enough means to make us happy. So for those who are, let's say, first generation learners in the village, livelihood will be a very big objective. And I read somewhere once that it takes at least 3 generations of good progress to study for the sake of studying, to study for the joy of studying. Because you have to go through the struggle of making a livelihood, and then you make a better livelihood. Then you got some elbow space to take chances and let your family make those choices. So I think, and that's why I talked about engaging students in school, because even now when I visit some of the schools and I see children who want to do something, but the parent says something else. Well-to-do parents. So I think letting people express themselves and pursue what they like to do, which will also change in their 80 years of working life, right? Is to equip them to learn how to learn, to remain curious, to go from livelihood to life and livelihood to life, livelihood and life. Okay. So I think it's about realizing the true potential. life is all about realizing your true potential. And I'm a great believer that all of us have enormous amount of potential, much more than what we realize. So realizing it, to me, is success. And that you can only do if you enjoy what you're doing in a setting that you're doing it in. And then as it's important that you sustain yourself so that you have a livelihood, but you also have a life. And so pursuing what you want to do, which will change with time, not in our days, we pursued one thing. And if you were lucky, if it was what we wanted to do. Otherwise, if you've done medicine and you wanted to do law, it was impossible. Now NEP says change. Go study for 2 years, work for 2 years and come back. So be free. Mind without fear, the mind that's set free. I think all of those good things.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pawar. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And at the end of the day, human beings look for a meaning. And, you rightly said the purpose of life is a life of purpose. The purpose of education is lifelong learning. It is about appreciating things. It's not just about employability. So clearly, you rightly said the purpose of education is education itself. And I think that's what needs to happen to education. And the ones that enjoy that automatically do well at whatever they do, because clearly it also brings in the element of mindfulness, doing whatever you do with being fully in it. And once you do that, you naturally excel at that. Education in India is at crossroads. Education elsewhere is on crossroads. And education is about social experiences. It is about learning. And hence, education technology has a role to play. But I don't think education technology will substitute for education or substitute for teachers. That's very clear. And with that, I'd like to end this week's BW Education Wednesday Wisdom. We were talking to Mr. Rajendra S. Pawar, the chairman of NIT and the founder of the NIT University. He founded the NIT University in 2009. So this is the 12th year of the university. And I'm sure in the next few years, you'll see more and more of the NIT University and its graduates making an impact both in India and abroad. Thank you, Mr. Pawar. It was good to speak to you. Look forward to more conversations. Those of you who missed this conversation, you can watch it on the YouTube channel of BW Business World or read it in the next issue of BW Education or the next issue of BW Business World. Thank you so much. We'll see you next Wednesday again, both at 3 to 4 p.m. on the role of technology in education, and then 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. where I'll talk to Mr. J.C. Chaudhary, who's the founder of Aakash Institute, and his son Aakash, about how they built Aakash and the partnership with Byju's. So I'll see you next week again. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you, Vasudha, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pawar. Thank you.
Thank you.